Let's begin tonight by delving into a somewhat bleaker subject, an era defined by widespread illnesses, severe hardships, and humble fare. We're about to explore the harsh realities of daily existence during the Middle Ages. Forget the romanticized portrayals of castles and knights that Hollywood often presents. The truth is, you'd likely struggle to survive even a single day in that period. So before you settle in, please take a moment to hit the like button and subscribe, but only if you genuinely find my content engaging. Also, I'd love to know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is there for you. It's always fascinating to see the diverse locations our audience tunes in from. Now dim the lights, perhaps turn on a fan for a gentle background hum, and let's gently embark on tonight's journey together. Imagine you've just awakened in the year 1325. The good news? You're still alive. The bad news? So are the fleas. Your bed is a decaying straw mattress, teeming with insects and hay that carries the distinct aroma of a barn floor because, well, it was a barn floor just 3 months prior. There's no luxurious memory foam, no soft pillows, and certainly no fine Egyptian cotton sheets. Instead, you're covered by a wool blanket that hasn't seen a wash since last winter, and now possesses the approximate weight of a small cow due to accumulated grime. You open your eyes as a distant church bell resounds, the medieval equivalent of an alarm clock, only considerably louder and far less forgiving. Your dwelling is a single-room wooden hut, devoid of windows, featuring an open-plan layout where your family, livestock, and various domestic insects coexist. The smell is a truly potent mix, a subtle blend of stale beer, human perspiration, goat, and an odor you desperately hope isn't mold, though deep down you suspect it is. Scented candles haven't been invented, and even if they had, they'd simply melt into your dirt floor. You attempt to stretch, but immediately regret it. The air is frigid, and your joints ache. At 22 years old, you're considered middle-aged by medieval standards. Your spine creaks like an ancient wooden door, and your knees sound like a sack of rocks being agitated by a bewildered farmer. Getting out of bed is always a gamble. The floor is either damp from last night's rain, which has seeped through the thatched roof, or encrusted with something your neighbor's chicken left behind. Either way, your bare feet have now become part of the local ecosystem. And privacy? That's an unknown concept. Your entire family, and perhaps a distant relative who simply never left, are all waking up beside you. There are no separate bedrooms, no curtains, no personal space, just shared existence. Welcome to a medieval European moming, where you're truly never alone, as parasites, rodents, and several other people are constant companions. And this is merely how your day begins. It only deteriorates from here. So you've managed to extricate yourself from your medieval nightmare of a bed. Congratulations. Now, nature makes its urgent demand, and it's far from polite. It's practically screaming. This is where you'll start longing for a modern bathroom. There's no toilet, no seat, no toilet paper, no flush, not even a slightly annoyed plunger in the commoner. In the 14th century, answering nature's call is an adventure, a peculiar social experiment, and often a minor public spectacle. If you're a peasant, your bathroom is likely a wooden bucket located behind your dwelling, which is already overflowing because Uncle Wolfstan had a rough night after consuming some dubious turnips. The stench is truly horrendous. You hold your breath, attend to your business, and then, here's the shocking part, you empty it into the street. Yes, directly into the street. You're supposedly meant to yell "Garde-à-l'eau," Old French for "watch out below," before tossing it out the window, though honestly, no one ever reacts quickly enough. Medieval town streets are essentially open sewers, charming rivers of human waste, animal droppings, and mysterious liquids you'd rather not investigate. If you're fortunate enough to reside in a town with public latrines, consider yourself lucky. You'll get to sit shoulder to shoulder with strangers in an outhouse where privacy is an illusion and ventilation is a cruel jest. You might engage in some small talk, but try not to inhale too deeply. Toilet paper? Unheard of. Most people use straw, leaves, old rags, moss, or if they're feeling particularly extravagant, a piece of wool. Sometimes, nothing at all. This might explain why handshakes weren't yet popular. And if you're in a castle, surely it's better, right? Well, partially. You might have a garderobe, a hole in the wall that deposits your waste directly into the moat. A brilliant idea, except your enemies are aware of this, and yes, attackers occasionally infiltrated through the waste chute. Talk about entering through the back door. So whether you're a farmer or a baron, medieval toileting is a ritual of humiliation. It's cold, public, perilous, and unfailingly disgusting. One misstep on a slick stone path and you're face first in humanity's leftovers. And you still haven't even brushed your teeth, but we'll get to that shortly. You've survived the latrine experience. You deserve a reward, perhaps a delightful breakfast, something warm, delicious, comforting. I'm sorry, but this is medieval Europe, and comfort is not on the menu. Breakfast, if one can even call it that, is a grim affair. There are no eggs Benedict, no whirring coffee machines, and certainly no avocado toast. You sit or squat near the fire, presented with a wooden bowl containing something resembling mud scraped from a boot. Welcome to your daily portion of pottage. Pottage is a thick, gloopy stew concocted from whatever ingredients are available. Grains, root vegetables, perhaps a few beans if you're lucky. It's been simmering in the same pot for days, sometimes weeks, with new ingredients simply added on top of the old. It's less a recipe and more an ongoing edible experiment. Alongside this, you get a chunk of bread so dense it could deflect arrows. It's made from coarse rye or barley flour, often extended with sawdust, ground acorns, or other inventive fillers, as pure wheat is a luxury reserved for the wealthy. This loaf is not your friend. You don't slice it, you negotiate with it. As for beverages, you won't be sipping orange juice or an oat milk latte. You're drinking beer. Yes, beer at 6 a.m. Why? Because the water is teeming with parasites and filth. So your day begins with weak ale, low in alcohol, high in survivability. Children drink it too. No one is particularly thrilled about it, but at least it won't kill you instantly. Fancy some meat or cheese? Keep dreaming. Those are reserved for Sundays and feast days, and only if your lord is feeling generous. Most peasants consume meat only a few times a year. Fresh fruit is only available when in season and not already fermented into wine. And don't even consider spices unless you're royalty. A mere pinch of pepper could cost more than your monthly wages. Salt is valuable enough to be kept under lock and key. So you chew your gritty bread, gulp your medieval beer, and try to ignore the possibility that a rat might have nibbled your porridge during the night. Breakfast doesn't energize you, it merely happens to you. And now that you're adequately underfed, it's time to toil as if your life depends on it, because truly it does. You finished your meager medieval breakfast, and now it's time to get dressed, though it won't offer much relief. Your entire wardrobe consists of precisely one outfit. One. It's a coarse wool tunic or linen shift that you've worn every single day for months, possibly even years. There's no concept of seasonal fashion. There's just wearing this until it falls apart or gives you a fungal infection. Underwear is optional. If you're fortunate, maybe a linen undershirt. If not, well, you're going commando beneath layers of scratchy, sweat-soaked wool, all clumsily stitched together by someone who likely had no idea what a proper seam looked like. There's also no washing machine, no soap, and absolutely no dry cleaner in sight. Consequently, your clothes are stained, stiff, and smell like a compost pile left to fester in a pigsty. Even if you wanted to wash them, it's not a simple task. You'd have to haul water from a river or well, heat it over a fire, scrub your tunic on a board with ashes or lye, and then hang it to dry in the sun, which appears approximately 3 days a year. And don't even get me started on shoes. If you possess any, they're made of untreated leather, barely stitched, and offer as much arch support as a banana peel. Most peasants simply go barefoot through mud, through dung, and through medieval landmines, otherwise known as sharp rocks and disease-ridden puddles. All of this leads to one inescapable conclusion. Your skin despises you. You are perpetually itching. Fleas, lice, and bed bugs reside on your body completely free of charge. Everyone has them. Nobles, lice-ridden monks, perpetually scratching children. Everyone is a walking insect farm. No one escapes. You'll find yourself scratching your armpit with a wooden spoon while conversing with the local priest, and no one will even blink an eye. Your skin is raw from constant rubbing, and your scalp is a battleground of bites. If you develop a rash, tough luck. There's no dermatologist, no hydrocortisone, no one to tell you it's probably scabies. You simply continue to suffer. And if by some miracle you don't get an infection, excellent. That rash will simply accompany you for the next 6 months like an unwanted medieval sidekick. Now that you're dressed in misery and enveloped in discomfort, it's time to venture outside and begin working yourself to death. Now that you're fully attired in scratchy, damp wool, it's time to flash your morning smile. Except you don't. Because in the Middle Ages, smiling is a risky endeavor, not emotionally, but dentally. There's no toothbrush, no toothpaste, no mouthwash, no floss. The concept of oral hygiene is about as popular as bathing, which is to say, not at all. Some individuals might chew on a twig or rinse with wine or vinegar, but for the most part, your teeth are left to fend for themselves, and they're not faring well. By your mid-20s, your smile resembles something unearthed from a haunted crypt. Cavities are widespread, gums are swollen, and those aren't just food stains on your teeth. That's decay. Your mouth harbors more rot than a medieval root cellar. Sugar, though not yet ubiquitous, is becoming more common among the affluent. Imported at great expense, it's primarily used in small cakes or as a display of wealth. If you're a noble, congratulations, you get to rot your teeth faster than the common folk. If you're poor, you'll achieve it slowly over time with fermented bread, gritty porridge, and years of vigorous chewing. Toothaches, get accustomed to them. They're like medieval weather, always present in the background. The kind of pain that compels you to consider prayer, heavy drinking, or even extracting the tooth yourself with a pair of pliers. And that's not a joke, that was an actual treatment. Dentists didn't truly exist, but barber surgeons did. Yes, the same individual who cuts your hair is also yanking out your molars by candlelight with an iron hook and absolutely no anesthesia. Infected tooth? Hope you enjoy fevers, because without antibiotics it can easily lead to sepsis and kill you from what began as a toothache. That's right. The same issue that sends us to a pharmacy today could be your demise in the 1300s. And there's no social reprieve either. Kissing, good luck. Halitosis, or bad breath, is pervasive. If you're single, you're not judged by your smile, you're judged by your land and your livestock. In essence, your mouth is a battleground, and it's losing the war. Now that your teeth throbbing, let's head outside, because your true work, the kind that will break your back, is just about to begin. Time to go to work. However, there's no office, no desk, no coffee breaks, and no prospect of promotion. Your occupation, if you're among the 90% of the population, is simple. Avoid dying while laboring for someone else's comfort. You are a peasant. Congratulations. This means you cultivate land that belongs to a lord who probably doesn't recall your name. You. Rise with the sun and cease only when it dips below the horizon. Your implements, a wooden hoe, a rusty sickle, and whatever bones remain intact within your body. There are no weekends, no clocking out, only sunrise to sunset, 6 days a week. Sunday is a day off, but only if you're not harvesting, fending off raiders, or fervently praying for your infected toe to stop turning black. The labor is relentless. Fields are plowed by hand or with oxen if you're affluent enough to own one. You dig trenches, sow seeds, pull weeds, and transport water until your spine begins to resemble the letter S. No one cares if you're exhausted. No one inquires about your mental well-being. If you're a woman, surprise, you don't just work in the fields. You also care for children, clean, cook, spin wool, feed animals, and pretend your husband's lice infestation isn't slowly migrating to your side of the bed. Children begin assisting around age 5, no school, no toys. just a tiny wooden rake and the dream of one day not succumbing to the flu. And if you're one of the rare few who aren't farmers, perhaps you're a blacksmith, a tanner, or a cooper grate. You still work with fire, corrosive chemicals, or animal entrails all day in poorly ventilated sheds. The compensation? Basically, bare survival. The perks? Occasional bleeding. Break a bone? Too bad. Get a fever? Drink some warm beer and keep going. You cannot afford to stop, not even for a day, because if you don't work, you don't eat. And if you don't eat, well, medieval Europe has a solution for that. You're simply replaced. So you grasp your shovel, ignore the blisters, and keep digging, because in the Middle Ages, your job isn't a career, it's a slow-motion endurance test. Now that your back is ablaze from laboring in the fields, let's discuss the weather. Because in the Middle Ages, temperature is less about seasons and more about a continuous celestial punishment. Let's start with winter. There's no insulation, no central heating, and no weatherproofing, just wooden walls with gaps wide enough to throw a chicken through. Your windows are covered with cloth, not glass. The fire in the hearth, a good idea in theory, but you lack sufficient firewood to sustain it because wood is costly and gathering it from the forest is sometimes illegal. Yes, you could be executed for picking up the wrong stick from the wrong forest. You bundle up in your single damp wool tunic, huddle near the dying embers, and still wake up with a frozen nose. Your feet are perpetually cold, often damp. Your fingers are so stiff they feel like tiny medieval popsicles. Frostbite isn't diagnosed, it's simply called bad luck. Now fast forward to summer. Sounds better, right? Wrong. In summer, your home transforms into a clay oven. There's no fan, no cross breeze, and absolutely no deodorant. You sweat through your layers, but you can't remove them because exposing too much skin is scandalous and also invites sunburn, insect bites, and social disapproval. Flies are out in full force, drawn to your unwashed body and the lingering scent of last week's goat stew fermenting in the comber. Mosquitoes buzz by your ear as you attempt to sleep, assuming you can sleep through the sounds of your neighbors yelling and babies crying. In the fields, the sun bakes you. No sunblock, no hat, unless you've fashioned one from straw like a desperate scarecrow. And the worst part, you still have to work. Heat stroke is merely referred to as taking a bad turn. So, you're either shivering in your own hovel, wondering if your toes will survive until spring, or you're sweating through your only pair of socks while your thighs chafe into oblivion. And the one constant, regardless of the season, your clothes still itch, your food is still awful, and your next chore is still waiting. Welcome to climate control, medieval style. There is none. Feeling thirsty? Need to freshen up? Want to splash a little water on your face to awaken from this damp, feverish nightmare of a life? Too bad. In medieval times, water isn't your ally. It's silently attempting to kill you. Let's begin with drinking. The nearby stream appears fresh, bubbling, and clear like something from a fantasy film. But spoiler alert, it's not. Upstream, someone just emptied a chamber pot into it, and if not that, a deceased pig is probably decomposing within. Parasites, bacteria, and the entire microbial army of medieval Europe await in every sip. That's why people drank beer, even children. But before you envision medieval kids engaging in keg stands, understand that it was small beer, low in alcohol, and high in survival. Brewing involved boiling the water, making it safer than whatever flowed through the town ditch. Wine was another option if you were affluent enough to afford it and unconcerned with being fully functional before noon. What about bathing? Surely water was used for cleanliness. In theory, yes. In practice, absolutely not. You see, back then, people believed that bathing actually opened your pores and allowed disease to enter. That's right. Washing yourself was considered medically risky. You were apparently cleaner if you never removed the protective layer of filth caked onto your skin. Communal bathhouses did exist, but they quickly acquired reputations as venues for gossip, scandal, and sometimes full-blown medieval extracurricular activities. So naturally, the church intervened and closed many of them down. Even if you did desire to bathe, it was a major undertaking. You'd need to fetch water from the well, boil it over a fire, fill a leaky wooden tub, and then pray no one else in the house used it before you, or worse, after. And rainwater collected in open barrels where birds defecate, insects breed, and moss thrives. Sounds refreshing, doesn't it? So whether it's entering your mouth, on your body, or onto your crops, water in the Middle Ages is less a life source and more a gamble. One wrong gulp, and you're spending your final days sweating in a straw bed, clutching your stomach and contemplating all your life choices. The next time you sip tap water, raise a glass to our ancestors. They didn't have the luxury of hydration without hazard, so you drank the water. Or perhaps you didn't. Maybe you simply stubbed your toe on a rock shaped like disappointment. Either way, you're ill. You require assistance. You need a doctor. Too bad you live in the Middle Ages, where medicine is essentially polite torture delivered with a theology degree. Let's begin with the diagnosis. Everything wrong with you, whether it's a cough, a rash, a broken bone, or the creeping plague, is attributed to an imbalance in your humors. The four humors were blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. According to medieval science, your health depended on maintaining their equilibrium like some sort of internal soup. Have a fever? Too much blood. The solution? Bloodletting. That's right. Let's drain your life force into a bowl using a dull blade or a hungry leech. And yes, barbers were often the ones performing this procedure. Imagine getting a haircut and a hemoglobin extraction in one sitting. A 2-for-1 deal, baby. Feeling melancholic or anxious? That's clearly an excess of black bile. The cure? Laxatives. Perhaps a warm herbal purge, or simply prayers and a cold compress while everyone avoids eye contact and starts preparing your coffin. Now, if you break a bone or sustain a nasty wound, you're in serious trouble. There's no anesthesia, unless you count passing out from sheer agony. Surgery is performed with knives that haven't been cleaned since the Crusades. Tools are heated over a fire, not for sterilization, but because they simply look more menacing that way. Antibiotics are centuries away. Germ theory hasn't been conceived yet. They believe disease originates from foul air or God's displeasure with your moral failings. Got a stomachache? Must have been your sinful thoughts. Hope you enjoy confessing while vomiting. If your condition worsens, you'll be treated with more leeches, possibly some crushed beetles and a priest at your bedside administering last rites, just in case. At this point, they're preparing for the ultimate cure, death. And if, by some miracle, you recover, everyone simply assumes God took pity on you. The doctor claims full credit and the leech gets a promotion. So yes, in the Middle Ages, medicine is less about healing and more about surviving the treatment. After a long day of labor, lice and leeches, it's finally time to eat. You shuffle back to your hovel, stomach growling, ready for the one remaining joy in life, a warm meal. Bad news, your meal is probably trying to kill you. Let's start with the fundamentals. Food preservation barely exists. There's no refrigerator, no freezer, just salt, smoke, or the hope that winter air keeps things fresh. Your meat, if you're fortunate enough to have any, has been hanging for days, covered in flies, marinated in questionable brine, and possibly shared with a rat or two. Bread is the cornerstone of the medieval diet, but even that isn't safe. In years of poor harvests, desperate peasants extend it with bark, sawdust, or even clay to make it stretch. And if it's rye season, there's an added bonus. Ergot, a fungus that induces convulsions, hallucinations, and sometimes death. It's like consuming bread laced with LSD and tetanus. Vegetables are only available when they're in season. And you know what's always in season? Turnips. So many turnips. Boiled, mashed, or floating in pottage, which, if you recall from an earlier section, is essentially a hot swamp of mysterious ingredients that's been simmering since your great-grandfather's funeral. Fruit might be available in the autumn, but it spoils quickly, and sugar is rare, expensive, and hoarded by the wealthy to showcase their blackened teeth. Dairy is another gamble. Fresh milk spoils in hours. Butter and cheese fare better, but they're loaded with bacteria. People consume them anyway because, frankly, it's either that or chew your boot leather. And let's discuss seasoning. Spices like pepper, cinnamon, or nutmeg are worth more than gold. For the average peasant, flavor comes from onions, salt, if you're lucky, and pain. Most meals taste like wet burlap sprinkled with sadness. But food isn't just a health hazard, it's a political one. Game animals belong to the Lord, not you. Caught poaching a rabbit, you could be fined, imprisoned, or even executed. That's right, your dinner could get you hanged. So as you sit down to consume your gray stew by flickering firelight, remember that every bite is a risk. But you eat anyway, because in the Middle Ages, food doesn't nourish, it tests you. It's evening now. You've worked, suffered, and barely digested your dubious stew. You might assume the day is winding down, but don't get too comfortable, because God is watching. So is the priest, and so is your neighbor Agnes, who will absolutely report you if you miss Mass. In medieval Europe, religion isn't just a part of life. It is life. The church dictates your calendar, your laws, your education, if you can read, your birth, marriage, death, and everything in between. Think of it as your spiritual landlord, and you're perpetually behind on rent. Every day is structured around the ringing of prayer bells. The town church bell chimes in the morning, at noon, and at night, not because people need reminders, but because missing prayer is a sin. Forget to bow? Sin. Eat meat on a Friday? Sin. Think about your neighbor's wife in that one dream? Double sin. And yes, hell is very real, vividly real. Priests describe it in glorious detail. Rivers of fire, lakes of boiling blood, demons with pitchforks, and eternal wailing. If the plague doesn't frighten you, eternal damnation certainly will. You cannot read the Bible yourself because it's written in Latin, a language reserved for monks, clergy, and that one noble child who's too refined for dirt. You rely entirely on the church to interpret everything for you. That means if the priest declares your crop failure is because you didn't pray hard enough, well, it's time to kneel harder. Tithes, a tenth of everything you own, are compulsory. If you grow wheat, you give wheat. If you raise chickens, you give eggs. If you have nothing, congratulations. You're spiritually bankrupt and financially doomed. Holidays, they're holy days, dozens of them. And while they offer breaks from labor, they are not for amusement. Therefore, your life is structured around attending Mass, observing fasts, confessing transgressions, and constantly reminding yourself that any form of joy is a perilous indulgence. To question the church is dangerous. Heretics face burning, witches are drowned, blasphemers are flogged, and skeptics are swiftly reformed. So you meticulously follow the rituals. You chant, you bow, you pray that your soul, after enduring this gritty existence, might eventually find its way to paradise, assuming the priest looks favorably upon you. Because in the Middle Ages, while God might be merciful, the church not so much. If you imagine the life of a medieval peasant was tough, try experiencing it as a woman. All the grime, hunger, and pervasive fear, compounded by childbirth, subservience, and social invisibility. In the Middle Ages, being a woman is akin to playing a video game on hard mode with no health potions and no restart button. From the moment of birth, a girl's life trajectory is largely predetermined. Marry young, bear children, serve your husband, and die exhausted. Education? Unlikely. Unless you hail from a noble family and are sent to a convent, your intellectual growth likely ceases around the time you master butter chewing and tunic mending. Marriage occurs early, incredibly early. It's not uncommon to be betrothed at 12 and pregnant by 14. It's not about affection, it's about land, livestock, and strategic alliances. Your opinion isn't a factor. Once married, you essentially become your husband's possession. Your duty is to produce heirs, feed everyone, maintain the household, and refrain from complaining. Because complaining might ear you the label of a nag, or worse, a witch. That particular accusation comes with a complimentary drowning or burning, depending on local custom. Childbirth is a fatal lottery. There's no prenatal care, no sterile instruments, no anesthesia. Midwives do their utmost, but even minor complications can lead to the death of the mother, the child, or both. Some women survive 10 pregnancies. Many do not survive even one. But don't worry, Once the baby arrives, your workload only increases. Now you have a wailing infant in a flea-infested hut, and you're still expected to nurse, cook, clean, and assist in the fields. You receive no respite. You are the respite for everyone else. If you're unmarried, you're viewed with suspicion. If you're widowed, you're vulnerable. If you're outspoken, you're dangerous. Women who didn't conform were frequently accused of witchcraft, especially if they possessed herbal knowledge, a strong personality, or simply gave someone a strange look on a rainy Tuesday. Even within the church, your role is confined. Nuns lived under stringent rules: no speaking without permission, no freedom of movement, and their spiritual worth always ranked below men's. In essence, if you are a woman in the Middle Ages, you are expected to endure, obey, procreate, and suffer in silence, ideally with a smile. Because even in an era of universal hardship, women were somehow expected to suffer gracefully. Thus far, you've contended with filth, starvation, social injustice, and quite possibly a goat. But just when you believe your day cannot possibly worsen, violence emerges, loud, brutal, and often entirely permissible by medieval standards. Let's be clear, the Middle Ages were far from peaceful. The concept of law and order largely equated to hoping the local lord wasn't in a foul mood. Violence pervaded every aspect of life, in the home, on the streets, on the battlefield, within church disputes, and sometimes even in queues at the communal bread oven. Crime was rampant, punishment was savage, and justice was more theatrical performance than genuine protection. Steal a loaf of bread and you might lose a hand. Accused of lying, your tongue might be pierced. Gossip too much, meet the scold's bridle, a metal mask strapped to your head with a bar in your mouth for correction, of course. Suppose you're accused of something grave, heresy, theft, witchcraft. How do you establish your innocence? Through torture, naturally. Welcome to trial by ordeal. In one version, you plunge your hand into boiling water to retrieve a stone. If it heals without infection in 3 days, you're innocent. If not, you're guilty. Another option, you're thrown into a river. If you sink, you're innocent and likely dead. If you float, you're guilty and will be punished regardless. It's like a medieval game show where the prize is survival and the host is actively rooting against you. And if you're condemned to death, it's a public spectacle. Executions are carried out before cheering crowds, hangings, beheadings, fumings. Sometimes people even bring snacks. It's the medieval equivalent of televised entertainment. Domestic violence was entirely commonplace. Husbands were permitted, even expected, to discipline their wives and children. Street brawls were routine. You could be beaten simply for glancing at a noble's horse the wrong way. And war was a constant undercurrent. Local feuds, territorial disputes, religious crusades. Someone was always marching off to stab someone else in the name of honor, God, or sheer boredom. Violence wasn't a societal breakdown in the Middle Ages. It was society. Everyone lived with the perpetual awareness that life was fragile, justice was arbitrary, and your neighbor might bludgeon you over a pig. So, tread carefully, keep your gaze lowered, and never trust anyone holding a club. At this juncture, you've navigated through lice, leeches, the misery of never-washed clothes, and the looming threat of public disembowelment. But now arrives the concluding chapter of most medieval lives, an early and inglorious death. If you're still alive and breathing past the age of 40, you're practically a celebrity, perhaps even referred to as the Old One, less a nickname and more a statistical marvel. Let's examine the facts. The average life expectancy hovers around 30 to 40 years, but this figure is significantly lowered by infant mortality. Nearly half of all children perished before reaching the age of 5. Disease, malnutrition, or one particularly harsh winter was all it took. No vaccines, no antibiotics, no hope. If you survived childhood, you entered adulthood already exhausted. Labor commenced as soon as you could walk upright, and by 25 your joints creaked like a monastery door. You might be missing several teeth, a finger, and most of your initial optimism. Women faced a particularly lethal challenge: childbirth. It was one of the leading causes of death for medieval women. No pain relief, no medical intervention, just prayer, hot water, and someone gripping your hand as you bled out on a straw-filled cot. For men, the dangers were different but equally relentless. Farming accidents, infections from minor wounds, a neighbor's drunken rage, a crusade gone awry. Even a walk to the market could be perilous if you encountered a bored bandit or an irate tax collector. Death could also arrive silently from the plague, which transformed cities into cemeteries overnight, or from famine, which could endure for entire seasons, decimating whole villages. Or from sheer bad luck, like consuming spoiled grain and spending your final hours hallucinating and screaming at the walls. And funerals? You were fortunate to even receive one. Bodies were often interred swiftly to prevent the spread of disease. No embalming, no polished coffins, just a hole, a few whispered prayers, and a shallow mound of earth, provided there was enough space left in the churchyard. So yes, in medieval times, life was brutal, brief, and constantly besieged by death in all its mundane forms. You didn't retire, you simply stopped appearing. And speaking of departures, let's proceed to your final segment. The medieval fantasy dissolves. So how has your day been? You've awakened in squalor, relieved yourself into a bucket, attempted to clean your teeth with hopeful thoughts, nearly fainted from hunger, toiled until your spine screamed for mercy, scratched your way through itchy wool, prayed to avoid the plague, and narrowly escaped a public execution for possessing a squirrel. Welcome to a single day in medieval Europe. Still fantasizing about becoming a knight? Reconsider. That romanticized depiction of the Middle Ages chivalrous swordsmen, noble ladies in towering castles, heroic battles, and feasts in candlelit great halls is a myth embellished by fairy tales and fantasy novels. In reality, the medieval world was grim, harsh, and profoundly unjust. Hierarchy dictated everything. If you were born impoverished, you remained impoverished. If you were born wealthy, congratulations, you had a better chance of survival. But you were still one bad soup away from dysentery and a hurried burial. Even the nobles weren't immune to suffering. Castles were drafty stone refrigerators filled with fleas, smoke, and politically motivated marriages. Sure, you possessed a fur cloak and a goblet of wine, but also a 50% chance of perishing in a skirmish or from an infected splinter. Not exactly luxury. The simpler times weren't simple. They were relentless. Everything took longer. Everything hurt more. Everything, from childbirth to chewing, carried significant consequences. Life was about survival, not leisure. And if you did manage to find a quiet moment to reflect, to dream, to envision something better, there wasn't much you could do with it. No social mobility, no modern medicine, no internet to Google, "What's this strange rash?" You lived, suffered, worked, and died within a 10-mile radius of your birthplace. But here's the most astonishing part. Through all of this, people still laughed, sang songs, told stories, fell in love, and found meaning. Not because life was easy, but because humans are resilient. Even in the darkest chapters, they carved out spaces for light. So tonight, as you recline in your clean bed with indoor plumbing, antibiotics, and central heating, perhaps offer a quiet thank you to the modern world and to your ancestors who battled rats, famine, and feudalism so you wouldn't have to. Long before she became Catherine the Great, Empress of all Russia, a mistress of reform, and an icon of ambition, she was simply Sophie. Bore Sophie August Friederike von Anhalt-Zerbst in 1729. She was the daughter of a relatively obscure German princely family. Her tiny duchy in Pomerania offered little in terms of political power. But Sophie herself possessed something no title could provide: razor-sharp intelligence, relentless charm, and a quiet, burning hunger for greatness. Her upbringing was strict. Her mother, Johanna, was cold and calculating, not a warm, nurturing figure, but a social climber obsessed with status. Sophie's father, a Prussian officer, was more distant than disciplinary. From a young age, Sophie learned to walk the fine line between obedience and cunning. She read voraciously, spoke multiple languages, and mastered the art of observing a room before speaking, skills that would soon become vital tools for survival in one of Europe's most brutal courts. When the Russian Empress Elizabeth Petrovna began searching for a wife for her heir, Grand Duke Peter, she looked beyond Russia's borders. Peter himself was of German descent, and Empress Elizabeth believed a foreign bride, pliant and grateful, would be easier to control. Sophie fit the description perfectly. Noble blood, Lutheran faith, which she'd be compelled to abandon, and a reputation for both grace and humility. At just 14 years old, Sophie was summoned to Russia. She arrived in the freezing capital of St. Petersburg in 1744, clad in thin German fabrics and wearing a diplomatic smile. Her mother propelled her forward like a chess piece. Sophie, however, had her own strategy in mind. To gain acceptance in Russian society, she converted to Orthodoxy, adopting the name Ekaterina Alexeyevna, Catherine. The ceremony was public, symbolic, and life-altering. She wasn't just changing religions, she was burning the bridge behind her, stepping into a foreign empire with no retreat. No one observing that quiet teenage girl in a fur-trimmed coat could have foreseen what lay ahead: betrayal, revolution, enlightenment, and empire. But from the moment Sophie set foot in the Russian court, she ceased being a pawn and began plotting how to become a queen. Catherine's marriage to Grand Duke Peter was intended to secure her position within Russian royalty. Yet, from the very outset, it felt more like a cage than a crown. Peter, heir to the Russian throne, was not the dashing prince of fairy tales. Awkward, immature, and fixated on toy soldiers, he showed far more interest in playing war games in his chambers than in governing an empire or demonstrating affection towards his new wife. Some accounts even suggest he refused to consummate the marriage for years. He idolized Frederick the Great of Prussia and resented the Russian court that had adopted him. In stark contrast, Catherine embraced Russia with fierce determination. She diligently learned the language, studied its history, and memorized Orthodox rituals. She yearned to belong. Peter yearned to escape. This fundamental mismatch wasn't merely emotional, it was political. The Russian court was a viper's nest of gossip, paranoia, and brutal power struggles. Empress Elizabeth still ruled with absolute authority, but her health was in decline. Everyone knew a transition was imminent, and everyone had their own agenda. Catherine was under constant surveillance. Her letters were intercepted, her friendships monitored, and her every action scrutinized. She couldn't trust her husband, her mother, who continued to whisper in her ear on behalf of foreign interests, or even her own servants. In this environment, alliances could transform into accusations overnight. But Catherine was no fool. She learned to play the court's intricate games quietly, cultivating allies in the shadows. She charmed military officers, befriended scholars, and developed a reputation for dignity and restraint, a stark contrast to her husband's childish tantrums and overt contempt for Russian traditions. Behind closed doors, Catherine immersed herself in the writings of Enlightenment thinkers like Voltaire and Montesquieu. While others perceived her as a young consort, she was secretly formulating a grand vision, not just for herself, but for Russia, a nation of strength, education, and reason. However, there was one significant obstacle. The longer Peter lived, the longer Catherine remained in limbo, a powerless wife to a man unfit to rule. So she waited, observed, and meticulously planned. She understood that the Russian throne wouldn't be inherited, it would have to be taken. In 1762, after nearly 2 decades of patient waiting, watchful observation, and quiet maneuvering, Catherine recognized her opportune moment and seized it with breathtaking precision. Empress Elizabeth had died, and Peter, now Peter III, was finally Tsar. However, his reign began to unravel almost immediately. In just a few short months, Peter alienated the church, offended the nobility, insulted the army, and openly praised Prussia, Russia's long-standing adversary. He reversed crucial policies, humiliated the clergy, and spoke candidly about divorcing Catherine to marry his mistress. The court, already wary of his erratic behavior, grew cold. The army, filled with generals loyal to Catherine, murmured in discontent in the corridors. Even ordinary Russians, devout and patriotic, viewed Peter as a foreign puppet who ridiculed their traditions. Catherine, witnessing this unfolding disaster, made her move. In July of that same year, while Peter was away at his summer palace, Catherine launched a bloodless coup d'état. Supported by key military officers, including her lover, Grigory Orlov, and his influential brothers, she rode through St. Petersburg in full regalia, was proclaimed Empress Catherine Phil, and secured the allegiance of the powerful imperial guard. Peter, caught off guard and without allies, surrendered within days. He was taken into custody and shortly thereafter found dead under mysterious circumstances. Officially, it was reported as a hemorrhoidal colic. Unofficially, it was murder. Catherine was now empress, not by birth, not by marriage, but by sheer will, intellect, and audacity. It was unprecedented. A foreign-born woman with no legitimate claim had ascended to the Russian throne without a single battle. But her real challenge was just beginning. She had to transform that bold grab for power into a lasting legacy. Would Russia accept her? Would the nobility respect her? Could she hold the empire together without succumbing to the same fate as her husband? Catherine understood that power gained through intrigue could be lost just as easily. She needed to rule not as a schemer, but as a visionary. And so began her transformation from a careful conspirator to a reforming empress, one who would redraw borders, embrace the Enlightenment, and redefine what it meant to be a woman in power. Once Catherine held the crown, she could have simply rested on her power. But she didn't. She envisioned something grander than merely sitting on a throne. She aimed to transform Russia, not only militarily or politically, but intellectually. While Peter had admired Frederick the Great and toy soldiers, Catherine idolized Voltaire, Diderot, and the audacious thinkers of the Enlightenment. She believed in reason, progress, education, and the role of a monarch as a servant of the people, even if she herself wielded absolute authority. Catherine didn't merely read Enlightenment philosophy, she embodied it. She corresponded directly with Voltaire for over 15 years, skillfully flattering him while defending her autocracy. She invited Diderot to her court and even purchased his entire library to provide him financial support. Behind closed doors, she meticulously studied legal texts, debated reforms, and formulated policies to modernize the empire. Her early reign was marked by concerted efforts to codify Russian law. In 1767, she formed the Legislative Commission, an ambitious project intended to completely rewrite Russia's legal code. Catherine's own Nakaz, instruction, was a political manifesto in disguise, advocating for equality before the law, condemning torture, and emphasizing the responsibility of rulers to serve the common good. For an empress in 18th century Russia, these ideas were radical. However, Enlightenment ideals had to contend with the realities of Russia, a vast, feudal, deeply conservative land ruled by nobles who preferred their serfs precisely where they were, subservient. Catherine understood this. While she championed reform, she moved cautiously. She abolished some forms of torture, expanded access to secular education, and established schools and libraries. Yet she also reaffirmed the nobility's control over their serfs to ensure their loyalty. This was Catherine's delicate balancing act. A philosopher queen in public, a pragmatic empress in private. She walked a tightrope between ideology and survival, between the glittering salons of Paris and the gritty politics of Moscow. Her vision for Russia was bold, but always calculated. In many respects, Catherine wasn't trying to make Russia European. She was striving to make Russia modern on her own terms. And that necessitated reform, yes, but wielded with an iron hand in a velvet glove. Catherine wasn't content with reforming Russia internally. She aimed to expand it externally, to forge an empire worthy of fear, admiration, and envy. Where Peter the Great had opened a window to the west, Catherine intended to dismantle the very walls. Under her leadership, Russia's borders stretched wider than ever before. She waged wars not merely to defend her crown, but to fundamentally redraw the map of Europe. One of her most significant campaigns was against the Ottoman Empire. These conflicts, fought in waves throughout the 1760s and 1770s, were not just about acquiring territory, they were about asserting influence. Catherine saw herself as the liberator of Orthodox Christians living under Muslim rule, and as the rightful protector of Eastern Europe. Under generals like Alexander Suvorov and Grigory Potemkin, Russia captured key regions, including Crimea, the northern coast of the Black Sea, and access to warm-water ports, a prize Russian czars had coveted for generations. These victories were not only military, they were profoundly symbolic. With each conquest, Catherine conveyed a clear message. Russia was no longer Europe's distant, backward cousin. It was a formidable continental power. She also turned her attention westward. Through a series of agreements and diplomatic maneuvers, Catherine participated in the partitions of Poland, dismembering the struggling Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth alongside Austria and Prussia. By the conclusion of the Third Partition in 1795, Poland had been erased from the map, and Russia claimed vast new territories and millions of new subjects. But Catherine didn't conquer solely with armies. She also colonized with ideas. New cities were established, trade routes were expanded, and German settlers were invited to cultivate Russian farmland. The empire became a diverse mosaic, stretching from the icy Baltic to the sun-drenched shores of the Black Sea. And throughout it all, Catherine remained the central force, poring over reports, issuing orders, and personally overseeing the expansion of her burgeoning empire. Critics would accuse her of being power-hungry, even imperialistic. But to Catherine, expansion wasn't merely ambition. It was destiny. A great ruler, she believed, was measured not only by ideas, but by borders. She didn't just want to rule Russia. She wanted to remake it as a civilized empire, feared by its adversaries, respected by its peers, and loyal to her alone. Despite all her brilliance and power, Catherine the Great was just as renowned for what transpired behind palace doors. And no, not all of it was whispered in libraries. Catherine's private life became one of the most discussed aspects of her reign. She had lovers, not just one or two, but a carefully curated succession of them, many decades her junior, often handsome and sometimes politically influential. She didn't conceal them. In fact, she frequently rewarded them with titles, estates, and pensions if they conducted themselves appropriately. If not, they were discreetly dismissed, sometimes with a polite thank you and a promotion elsewhere. Among the most significant of these lovers was Grigory Potemkin, a man as intelligent as he was audacious. Their relationship blurred the lines between romance, politics, and partnership. Some historians even believe they may have secretly married. Together they shaped military campaigns, colonization projects, and the transformation of southern Russia. Potemkin was more than a lover. In many ways, he was her co-ruler. Still, Europe couldn't overlook the scandal. Gossip swirled. Satirical pamphlets depicted her as lustful, insatiable, even deranged. And after her death, the rumors only intensified. The most infamous and completely false, grotesque tale involving a horse was spread by her enemies to tarnish her legacy. But why this intense focus? The answer is simple. Catherine was a woman who exercised power without apology. In a world where female rulers were expected to embody either saintly virginity or tragic fragility, she resolutely refused to conform. She lived, loved, and governed on her own terms, and that made her a formidable figure. Ironically, while her detractors painted her as immoral, Catherine herself held deeply philosophical views on love and sexuality. She believed that pleasure was a natural component of life and that personal relationships did not necessarily threaten public responsibilities. She successfully compartmentalized emotion from governance, a feat few male rulers achieved. In truth, her liaisons were often strategic. She surrounded herself with men who were loyal, capable, and politically advantageous. And when they ceased to be so, she released them, usually with a smile and a generous retirement package. Catherine's romantic life did not undermine her rule. It was an integral part of her strategy, a fusion of passion and power that rendered her unforgettable, envied, and feared. For all her charisma and control, Catherine's reign was not without its dangers. In 1773, that danger materialized in the form of a bearded Cossack named Yemelyan Pugachev. He was no ordinary rebel. Pugachev brazenly claimed to be none other than Peter III, Catherine's deceased husband. According to his narrative, he had survived the coup and now returned to reclaim the throne from the German usurper. It was preposterous. Peter was long gone. But to Russia's oppressed and exhausted lower classes, the truth of the claim was irrelevant. It simply needed to offer hope. Pugachev promised liberation, an end to serfdom, reduced taxes, and land for the common people. His words ignited a conflagration across the Volga River region, particularly among Cossacks, peasants, and old believers. In an era when the chasm between nobles and serfs had widened brutally, his pledges sounded like salvation. The Pugachev rebellion evolved into the largest peasant uprising in Russian history. Towns were captured, fortresses fell, and nobles were slaughtered. For a terrifying period, it appeared as though the empire itself might disintegrate. Catherine was profoundly shaken. This was not a foreign war she could win with cavalry and treaties. This was an internal revolt, her own people rising against the very system she governed. Yet Catherine did not panic. She acted decisively. She dispatched professional military forces to ruthlessly suppress the rebellion. Pugachev's forces were defeated in 1774. He was captured, publicly displayed in an iron cage, and ultimately beheaded in Moscow. A stark public warning to all who dared to follow his path. Afterward, Catherine intensified her grip on order and control. Her earlier dreams of liberating the serfs quietly faded into silence. The rebellion had starkly revealed the limitations of Enlightenment ideals in a country still shackled by feudalism. She now relied more heavily on the nobility, who offered their loyalty in exchange for absolute control over their serfs. This marked a turning point. The empress who once quoted Voltaire now prioritized stability over philosophy. Reforms became cautious, surveillance increased. Any whisper of rebellion was to be crushed before it could fully breathe. Pugachev may have lost his head, but he left behind a haunting warning for Catherine, that power built on inequality could only endure for so long before the storm inevitably broke through. By the time Catherine the Great approached the final years of her life, she had governed Russia for over 3 decades, a tenure longer than any female ruler in Russian history. From the moment she seized power, she had defied expectations, reshaped her empire, and redefined what a woman and a monarch could truly be. Under Catherine's reign, Russia blossomed into a formidable European powerhouse. Its territory expanded by over 200,000 square miles, incorporating Crimea, significant portions of Poland, and vast stretches of the Black Sea coast. These were not merely military triumphs. They were strategic maneuvers, securing warm water ports and fundamentally altering trade dynamics. However, her legacy was not confined to maps alone. Catherine also left an indelible cultural imprint. She played a pivotal role in founding the Hermitage Museum, amassing one of Europe's greatest art collections, and maintaining correspondence with the foremost minds of the Enlightenment. Her court became a vibrant center of sophistication, art, and intellectual ambition. In a country often perceived as backward by Western Europeans, Catherine firmly placed Russia on the cultural map. She modernized education, establishing schools specifically for girls, and promoted the widespread printing of books. She introduced smallpox inoculation to Russia, even publicly receiving the vaccine herself, an act of scientific courage for her era. Yet her reign was also characterized by profound contradictions. While she admired Enlightenment ideals, she never liberated the serfs. In fact, she extended serfdom deeper into Russia's newly acquired territories. Her reforms, while impressive, remained predominantly top-down, designed to refine the empire without fundamentally altering its societal bedrock. Still, Catherine's rule brought both stability and an ambitious drive. She understood that power was not inherited, It was meticulously crafted, skillfully managed, and constantly defended. She ruled not by divine right, but by sheer force of will, political brilliance, and relentless calculation. She was called many things: a usurper, a tyrant, a reformer, a seductress. But above all, she was effective. When she died in 1796, Russia was wealthier, larger, and more formidable than it had been in centuries. She left behind a secure throne, an expanded empire, and a legend that would endure for centuries. Catherine didn't merely reign. She ruled with intellect, strategy, and an unapologetic command of history. And in doing so, she became more than an empress. She became a myth. For all her immense power and the lasting legacy of her expansions, Catherine the Great remained, at her core, a woman navigating a world dominated by men, yet reshaping it in her own image. Beneath the regal imperial portraits and official state decrees was an individual acutely aware of the precariousness of her position. She was not born Russian. She ascended to the throne through a coup. She governed an empire that fundamentally resisted the idea of a woman in charge. And yet, she not only persevered, but truly flourished. Catherine was never content to be merely ornamental. She read incessantly, wrote voluminously, and never ceased learning. Her daily schedule was rigorous, hours spent poring over reports, corresponding with foreign powers, editing state documents, and skillfully managing a court rife with rival factions. She was not satisfied with simply occupying the throne. She actively worked the throne like a stateswoman born to it. She was also in many ways solitary. She surrounded herself with courtiers, lovers, and artists, yet she wrote in her memoirs of how few individuals she could genuinely trust. Her son, Paul, whom she deeply distrusted and deliberately kept away from state affairs, matured into a man she feared would undo all her progress. Her most profound emotional partnership with Grigory Potemkin eventually transitioned into a deep friendship, but his death in 1791 left a wound that never truly healed. Catherine meticulously crafted her public image. She understood the power of narrative and wielded it more effectively than most monarchs of her era. She presented herself as the mother of Russia, an enlightened monarch, a warrior empress, and a patron of the arts. But beneath these carefully constructed roles was a woman who had endured rejection, betrayal, scandal, and rebellion, yet relentlessly pressed onward. When she died in 1796, she left behind an empire utterly transformed, but also lingering questions. Could she have done more to abolish serfdom? Were her Enlightenment ideals ultimately compromised by political pragmatism? Was she more of a reformer or simply an effective ruler? History remembers her by the title she never explicitly claimed for herself, the Great. It wasn't because she was flawless or inherently kind or perfectly just. It was because she seized power and wielded it on her own terms, in a time and place where women were not expected to possess any. She didn't merely wear the crown. She fundamentally redefined what it meant to ear one. In the humid depths of the Chiapas jungle in southern Mexico, the ancient ruins of Palenque whisper tales from the heart of the Maya civilization. Imposing temples ascend above the dense canopy, their limestone facades weathered by centuries, yet still brimming with undiscovered secrets. And in 1994, one such secret dramatically revealed itself. A team of Mexican archaeologists, led by Fanny Lopez Jimenez, was conducting a survey of Temple 3, a relatively modest pyramid situated adjacent to the more renowned Temple of the Inscriptions, the celebrated burial site of the mighty King Pakal the Great. Temple 3, also known as the Temple of the Red Queen, was not anticipated to yield significant findings until they noticed something unusual: a sealed, concealed chamber beneath the structure. It was untouched by looters. It was pristine. When the archaeologists breached the chamber and descended inside, they discovered a stone sarcophagus, resting in profound silence. The air itself seemed heavy with the weight of centuries. As they lifted the lid, a brilliant, shocking red dust billowed up like smoke. The interior was saturated with powdered cinnabar, a highly toxic mercury sulfide ceremonially used by the ancient Maya. And within that crimson cloud lay the skeleton of a woman. She had been interred with immense care and reverence. Her bones, though fragile, were remarkably intact, her skull still adorned with a jade mask. Her body was surrounded by a wealth of funerary offerings, necklaces, diadems, and ear spools, all intricately fashioned from jade and shell. Every aspect of the burial unequivocally proclaimed royalty. Yet there was no inscribed name, no identifying glyphs. It represented one of the richest female burials ever unearthed in Mesoamerica, yet it remained a complete enigma. Why was she buried in red powder? Who was this woman? Was she a queen, a priestess, or perhaps even Pakal's wife? Researchers christened her the Red Queen, and the name endured. But even with advanced modern forensics, they couldn't definitively ascertain her identity, only that she had lived around the 7th century, during Palenque's golden age. Unlike most Maya tombs, hers had been deliberately concealed, untouched, and intentionally isolated. Her burial wasn't merely ceremonial, it was profoundly spiritual. This woman was not intended to be remembered through words. She was meant to be honored through ritual, through color, and through the profound mystery she left behind. The most haunting characteristic of the Red Queen's tomb wasn't her jade jewelry or the eerie silence of the sealed chamber. It was the red dust itself, a dense layer of powdered cinnabar covering everything: the sarcophagus, the chamber walls, her bones, and even the offerings placed around her. It clung to the stone like dried blood. To the Maya, this was no accident. Cinnabar, derived from crushed mercury sulfide, was considered one of the most sacred and dangerous substances in the ancient world. Its vibrant red hue wasn't merely visually striking. It symbolized blood, rebirth, and the vital life force that bridged the human and divine realms. Red was revered. It was the color of the sunrise, of sacrifice, of life emerging from the embrace of death, and its significance transcended mere symbolism. It was deeply spiritual. Covering the deceased in cinnabar was a ritual intended to transform the body, preserving it not for eternity, but for a sacred transition. In Maya belief, death was not an end but a passage, a crossing into another cosmic layer. Thus the Red Queen, whoever she was being prepared not just for burial, but for deification. However, there's another crucial aspect to this. Cinnabar is toxic. Repeated exposure can lead to mercury poisoning, tremors, hallucinations, and even death. The Maya likely didn't grasp the underlying chemistry, but they undoubtedly perceived its potency. It was volatile, powerful, and dangerous. To immerse a corpse in it was to unequivocally declare that this individual was no ordinary mortal. In Palenque, very few individuals were interred with cinnabar. Pakal the Great, the powerful king whose pyramid dominates the site, was one such exception. His body, like hers, was also saturated in the red powder. That singular detail fueled immediate speculation. Was the Red Queen his wife, his mother, or someone of equally divine status? Her skull had been carefully positioned on a layer of jaguar skin, another potent sacred symbol. Surrounding her, bone needles, obsidian blades, and miniature jade figurines hinted at rituals performed either during her lifetime or in her honor at her death. Every element of her burial conveyed a story without words, a narrative of power veiled in secrecy, of a woman prepared to journey into the underworld, not in silence, but in a solemn ceremony, drenched in the color of sacrifice. Surrounding the Red Queen's crimson-drenched remains was a world of profound silence, broken only by the shimmering gleam of jade, shell, and obsidian. These were not mere adornments. They were deliberate offerings, each meticulously chosen to accompany her on the perilous journey to the Maya afterlife, known as Xibalba. At her sides lay jade necklaces, heavy and cool, their polished surfaces still radiating after 1,300 years underground. Jade was more than just beautiful, it was profoundly sacred. The Maya regarded it as a potent symbol of eternal life. It embodied the verdant green of maize, the vibrant vitality of the jungle, and the very breath of the gods. Only the highest elite were interred with jade. For the Red Queen, it graced her chest, wrists, and ears, a clear testament to her significant influence in life, perhaps even divine favor. One of the most poignant artifacts was the jade funerary mask placed delicately over her face. Unlike the golden death masks of ancient Egypt, this one was subtle, meticulously constructed from dozens of minuscule mosaic tiles arranged to precisely mimic the contours of her skull. The mask served a vital ritual function, to safeguard her soul, to preserve her identity, and to present her as divine in the eyes of the gods. Scattered near her bones were bone needles, obsidian blades, and shell artifacts. These could have been tools used in rituals or symbols denoting her status as a priestess, a healer, or a royal matriarch. One bone pin bore a faint but purposeful engraving, a small echo of her voice, now lost to the annals of time. At her feet and along the edges of the tomb were ceramic vessels, still sealed, likely once filled with offerings of food, drink, or incense to sustain her spirit beyond death. The Maya believed the afterlife was a complex and perilous journey, multi-layered and fraught with challenges. These items were not luxuries, they were vital necessities. To modern eyes, the tomb felt remarkably intimate, not overflowing with extravagance, but imbued with clear intention. There was no gold, no chariots, no ostentatious display, just carefully selected items imbued with profound spiritual weight. It served as a spiritual map for the soul. Through these invaluable treasures, we gain a profound insight into how the Maya understood death, not as an ultimate finality, but as a potent transition of power. The Red Queen was not buried to be forgotten. She was being prepared to ascend. Despite the grandeur of her tomb, the Red Queen left behind one haunting enigma. No name, no inscriptions adored her sarcophagus. No glyphs on the walls identified her. She was undeniably someone of immense power. But who, precisely? From the moment her tomb was unearthed, scholars immediately began attempting to connect the missing pieces. The most compelling theory posits that the Red Queen was Ixtacbuajau, the wife of Kinich Janab Pakal, known today as Pakal the Great, Palenque's most celebrated ruler. Ixtacbuajau was more than just Pakal's consort. She was born into nobility and married into Palenque's royal dynasty at a young age. She bore at least 3 sons, all of whom achieved high status, and she played a crucial ceremonial role throughout her husband's reign. If anyone merited such an honorable burial, it was surely her. Further supporting this theory is the tomb's precise location, mere feet away from Pakal's own magnificent burial chamber within the Temple of the Inscriptions. This close proximity suggests a deliberate pairing, husband and wife, even in death. And then there's the cinnabar. Only 2 burials in all of Palenque were found with such extensive cinnabar coverage, Pakal's and the Red Queen's. It's highly improbable this was a mere coincidence. However, this is where the mystery deepens. DNA tests were conducted on both sets of remains in the hope of confirming this connection, but the results were inconclusive. The woman's bones, however, revealed no direct maternal link to Pakal. Yet this didn't preclude a spousal relationship. After all, marriage doesn't require shared ancestry. Some scholars have posited that she could have been Sak Kuk, Pakal's powerful mother, who governed Palenque as queen regent until her son reached maturity. Others suggest she might have been a high priestess, a sister, or a revered royal ancestor whose name has simply been lost to the inexorable erosion of history. Nevertheless, the evidence most strongly points to Ixtacbuajau, queen by title, a mother of kings and a spiritual counterpart to Pakal. The absence of a name might not have been an oversight. It could have been entirely intentional. In Maya cosmology, the soul persisted not through monumental inscriptions, but through ritual, symbol, and the subtle whispers of the earth. And so the Red Queen remained suspended between legend and verifiable truth. A woman who held sway, remembered not in chiseled stone, but in brilliant scarlet and profound silence. To truly comprehend the Red Queen, we must first grasp the context of her world. A world where Maya women, particularly those of royal lineage, wielded far more influence than many initially perceive. In Maya civilization, politics was frequently a family affair. Royal women were not merely passive consorts. They were active diplomats, influential priestesses, and strategic power brokers. They conducted elaborate rituals, sponsored the construction of temples, and played crucial roles in upholding dynastic legitimacy. Their bloodlines were vital political capital, used to forge alliances and secure claims to the throne. Consider Sakkuk, for instance, the mother of Pakal the Great. When the throne of Palenque became vacant, she personally assumed authority and ruled as queen regent until her son came of age. She was not a mere placeholder. She was a ruler in her own right, issuing decrees and overseeing significant construction projects. Without her, Pakal might never have ascended to power, and she was not an isolated anomaly. Across the Maya world, in sites like Yaxchilan, Naranjo, and Calakmul, inscriptions depict women performing major ceremonies, engaging in diplomatic negotiations, participating in warfare, and occasionally ruling outright. They were frequently portrayed in stelae and murals, adorned in elaborate headdresses and regalia, standing alongside kings as equals, or sometimes even elevated above them. Their words were carved in glyphs. Their names were remembered until they weren't. By the time Spanish conquistadors arrived centuries later, much of that collective memory had faded. The colonial perspective often portrayed indigenous women as silent figures in a male-dominated society. However, archaeological findings paint a different picture, one of complex gender roles, where power was negotiated and earned, not simply inherited. This broader context casts the Red Queen in a new light. She may not have officially ruled in name, but her burial rich, sacred, and strategically positioned beside Pakal's strongly suggests she was a central pillar in the royal order. Her jade mask was not merely decorative, it was a potent symbol of identity, of power wielded in life and safeguarded in death. Her very bloodline may have been the crucial bond that maintained Palenque's dynasty. In Maya civilization, a queen was not merely a queen. She was a guardian of sacred lineage, a significant voice in ceremonial life, and often the bridge between the gods and humanity. The Red Queen may be nameless to us, but in her world, she was never voiceless. The Red Queen's burial wasn't merely accompanied by treasures. She was interred within architecture rich with purpose, intricately layered with Maya cosmology, ritual symbolism, and intentional design. Her tomb was not simply a grave, it was conceived as a gateway to eternity. Her body was discovered inside Temple 3, one of the smaller pyramids nestled within the heart of Palenque. Yet, its close proximity to the Temple of the Inscriptions, the final resting place of Pakal the Great, is profoundly telling. These temples were not erected haphazardly. Their positioning was sacred, guided by intricate astrology, foundational myths, and dynastic legacy. Temple 3 rises with modest grandeur compared to its more celebrated neighbor, yet it conceals something even more intimate, a sealed crypt, untouched by looters, preserved in perfect condition. It was constructed deep within the temple's core, accessible only by a steep, narrow staircase. The descent into her tomb feels almost symbolic, a ritual journey downward into the underworld. The chamber itself is stark, crafted from precisely cut stone, sealed tightly for over 1,300 years. No glyphs or murals adorn the walls, no ornate carvings narrate her story. But perhaps that very silence is intentional. This was a space not for the living to interpret, but for the dead to undergo transformation. At the center, her sarcophagus rests like an altar, meticulously crafted from limestone. It deliberately echoes the grand stone coffin of Pakal next door. While Pakal's lid is famously engraved with elaborate scenes of cosmic rebirth, the Red Queen's tomb is more understated. The focus is inward, on the body, on the cinnabar, on the solemn ritual of death itself. And yet subtle architectural cues subtly hint at deeper meaning. The tomb is aligned east to west, a symbolic path mirroring the sun's journey from life to death. The chamber is small but powerful. It feels deliberate, personal, a sacred enclosure designed for someone deeply revered. Maya temples functioned as cosmological tools, acting as bridges between the heavens, the earth, and the underworld. To be interred within one was to be elevated beyond the human realm. The Red Queen's eternal home was not an afterthought. It was a meticulously constructed shrine, a place where death became profound transformation. Her bones repose in stone, her essence resides in cinnabar, and her legacy is etched within the very architecture itself. A temple that communicates without words, unequivocally telling us that she mattered. To the ancient Maya, death was not the final act. It was a profound threshold, a sacred passage into the underworld known as Xibalba. And for an individual of the Red Queen's stature, this crossing was not merely spiritual. It was deeply political, cosmological, and intricately ritualized. Burial rites were meticulously choreographed events, rooted in ancient myths and designed to guide the soul through the treacherous layers of the underworld. Maya texts and iconography reveal that Xibalba was far from a peaceful afterlife. It was a labyrinth of darkness, rivers of blood, formidable trials, and formidable gods of death. Only those properly interred, ritually prepared, and spiritually equipped could successfully navigate this perilous journey. The Red Queen was buried wrapped in cinnabar, encased in stone, and surrounded by offerings, all clear indicators of an elite burial. But there's more. The presence of bone needles and obsidian blades in her tomb hints at auto-sacrifice rituals, possibly symbolic tools representing rites she had performed in life or that were reenacted at her burial to empower her spirit. Her funerary mask, meticulously assembled from jade tiles, was not simply decorative. It may have served as a spiritual vessel, preserving her face and identity as she journeyed into the afterlife. In Maya belief, the face was considered a mirror of the soul, and the soul needed to be recognized by the gods. The ceramic vessels surrounding her may have once contained chocolate, maize, water, or even pulque to nourish her in the next world. Other items like stingray spines or conch shell trumpets could have represented spiritual tools, invocations to the gods, or tokens of ritual communication. Burial was not just a farewell, it was a profound transformation. The Maya believed in cycles, death as a seed, burial as planting, and the afterlife as rebirth. Kings and queens were often viewed as earthly incarnations of deities, and in death they returned to those divine origins. The Red Queen, enveloped in the color of blood, entombed within a pyramid, and honored with rich offerings, was being prepared for rebirth, not as a mortal, but as a being inextricably linked to the sacred order of the cosmos. Her burial was not the end of her story. It was the genesis of her legend. Just a few paces from the Red Queen's final resting place lies one of the most iconic tombs in Mesoamerica, that of Kinich Janab Pakal, known simply as Pakal the Great. His interment within the magnificent Temple of the Inscriptions is celebrated for its exquisite artistry, monumental scale, and profound spiritual symbolism. However, what makes the Red Queen's tomb so truly extraordinary is not merely its contents, but its precise location. Her sarcophagus was discovered hidden within Temple 3, situated directly adjacent to Pakal's grand monument. In a city like Palenque, where every temple was meticulously positioned to reflect intricate cosmic principles, this close proximity was no mere coincidence. It was an intentional statement, etched in stone. Many scholars firmly believe the Red Queen was Ix Akebu Ajao, Pakal's queen and trusted consort. While her tomb lacks explicit inscriptions, the similarities between their burials are striking. Both were enveloped in cinnabar, both were interred within pyramids, both were buried with jade, and both were treated with extreme reverence. These rituals remarkably mirror each other, as if forming two halves of a sacred narrative. Pakal's famous sarcophagus lid depicts him descending into the underworld tree, a cosmic scene of death and rebirth. The Red Queen's simpler tomb contains no such explicit iconography, but the profound symbolism resides in the very pairing itself. If Pakal represented the sun, journeying through the underworld at night to rise again, then the Red Queen may have embodied the moon, the feminine force that follows its own mysterious celestial path. Together they personified a cosmic duality, masculine and feminine, king and queen, sun and moon, order and ritual. In Maya mythology, rulership was not a singular concept. It was inherently relational. Cosmic harmony necessitated balance, and that balance extended into the dynastic court. By placing the Red Queen beside Pakal, the Maya were preserving not just a marriage, but a profound cosmic partnership. Their proximity in death may have mirrored their roles in life. A queen not behind, but beside her king, sharing not only a throne, but an enduring legacy. In their silent tombs they communicate without words, two souls enshrouded in cinnabar and stone, eternally joined across the fabric of time, creating one of history's most sacred silences. Although her name has been lost to the annals of time, the Red Queen of Palenque endures not as a forgotten relic, but as one of the most enigmatic and powerful women of the ancient world. Her tomb, sealed for over 1,300 years, now whispers across centuries, prompting questions that echo ever louder with each new discovery. She represents a mystery that still resists complete comprehension. We may never definitively know her exact identity. No glyph carved her name, no stela recounted her story, and yet the meticulous care evident in her burial, the opulence of her offerings, the profound symbolism of her crimson-drenched bones, all speak of a woman of immense importance, not merely as a wife or consort, but as someone who wielded genuine influence, held significant spiritual weight, and possessed royal blood. Today, the Red Queen compels us to reevaluate long-held assumptions. She serves as a powerful reminder that in the ancient Maya world, women were not silent figures. They led rituals, governed cities, and profoundly shaped dynasties. While kings like Pakal have long commanded the spotlight, the Red Queen's reemergence reminds us that power was not solely the domain of men. It flowed through mothers, queens, priestesses, and visionaries. Her legacy extends beyond the treasures she left behind. It is the conversation she has initiated among archaeologists, historians, artists, and storytellers. Every jade bead, every layer of cinnabar, every architectural choice within her temple eloquently tells us something deliberate. This woman mattered. And perhaps that is the most extraordinary aspect of her story. Not what we know, but what we still do not. The Red Queen teaches us that history is not merely a collection of facts. It is a living puzzle, a shared human longing to connect with the past. In that sense, her legacy is still unfolding. She rests enveloped in red, the color of life and sacrifice, of blood and rebirth. Her face, once concealed behind a jade mask, now gazes back at us through the lenses of science, art, and wonder. She remains nameless, but not voiceless, mysterious, yet not forgotten. The Red Queen may have governed a kingdom in life, but in death, she commands something far greater, our imagination. Her tomb was sealed in stone, her story written in silence, and yet somehow she still speaks. Frida Kahlo was born on July 6, 1907, in the vibrant district of Coyoacán, then a village on the outskirts of Mexico City. Her childhood home, the Casa Azul, the Blue House, was a place filled with color, contradiction, and quiet strength. It would later become a sanctuary, a battleground, and a museum dedicated to one of the most iconic artists of the 20th century. Frida was the third of 4 daughters born to Guillermo Kahlo, a German-Hungarian photographer, and Matilda Calderón, a devout Catholic of indigenous and Spanish descent. Her parents were stark opposites. Guillermo, reserved and intellectual; Matilde, religious and emotionally distant. Frida would inherit her father's introspection and artistic eye, but also her mother's fierce resilience. As a child, Frida was imaginative, outspoken, and daring. She read voraciously and posed questions most adults preferred not to answer. However, at the age of 6, she contracted polio, which left her right leg thinner and weaker than the other, a physical disparity she attempted to conceal with long skirts, yet never allowed to restrict her spint. The illness confined her to bed for months, isolating her from other children. During this period, she grew particularly close to her father, who encouraged her to exercise, ride bicycles, and maintain mental acuity. Unlike most girls of her time, Frida did not aspire to become a wife or a homemaker. Her ambition was to become a doctor. At age 15, she enrolled in the prestigious National Preparatory School in Mexico City, one of only a handful of girls accepted. There she distinguished herself not merely for her intelligence, but for her rebellious wit, radical thinking, and distinctive sense of style. She joined a group of young intellectuals known as the cachuchas, who passionately debated philosophy, literature, and politics. Frida was drawn to revolution, to ideas that challenged convention. But even in those early years, before the bus crash that would permanently alter her body and before the fame that would define her legacy, Frida Kahlo was already painting herself into existence with sharp edges, uncompromising ideas, and an identity too vast to fit within anyone else's expectations. She wasn't just growing up in Coyoacán, she was preparing to entirely remake herself. On September 17, 1925, Frida Kahlo's life irrevocably fractured into two distinct periods: the girl she had been and the woman she was compelled to become. That afternoon, she boarded a wooden bus with her boyfriend, Alejandro Gomez Arias, after school. They were laughing, playfully teasing each other, and likely engaging in a lively debate. Frida never did anything halfway, but moments later, the bus collided with a streetcar, and in an instant, her future unraveled into pain, metal, and silence. The crash was horrific. The streetcar crushed the bus against a wall, splintering wood and flinging passengers. Frida was impaled by an iron handrail. It entered her left hip and exited through her pelvis. Her spinal column fractured in 3 places. Her right leg was shattered. Her foot dislocated. Her collarbone and ribs broke. Her shoulder was dislocated. Her abdomen was pierced. She was just 18 years old. A man covered her with a borrowed overcoat. Someone else noticed her body was sparkling, not from blood, but from the gold powder she had been carrying in a pouch. It had exploded on impact, dusting her broken form in what looked like glittering ash. Frida was taken to the Red Cross hospital and underwent numerous surgeries over the following months. She spent weeks in a body cast, flat on her back, immobile, writhing with infection and uncertainty. The future she'd imagined of becoming a doctor slipped further away with every passing day. But in that stillness, something began to stir. Her father gave her brushes. Her mother rigged a special easel to hang above her bed. A mirror was placed on the canopy so she could see herself. And there, lying in plaster and agony, Frida began to paint. First out of boredom, then out of obsession. Her first subjects were her own reflection, because she was all she had. But what emerged wasn't vanity, it was survival. The crash had broken her physically, but it had also opened a door into her own mind, her own body, and eventually into the surreal language of pain and identity that would define her art. The girl who wanted to heal others now began healing herself, one brushstroke at a time. As Frida Kahlo lay encased in plaster and steel, her body battling itself with every breath, she began to paint. What started as a form of therapy soon became a language that was deeply personal, brutally honest, and often hard to look at, which was precisely the point. Frida didn't paint pretty flowers or polite landscapes. She painted pain, her pain, physical, emotional, and existential. Her first subjects were self-portraits, not because she was vain, but because, as she famously said, I paint myself because I'm so often alone, and because I am the subject I know best. Her early works were small in scale, painted on tin or wood panels, inspired by Mexican retablos, devotional paintings meant to tell stories of suffering and miracles. Frida turned this tradition inward. Her body became the canvas. Her emotions became the altar. She painted herself as split, as pierced, as bleeding. In one painting, she is impaled by nails like a modern-day martyr. In another, she floats in a barren landscape, tethered to a broken column, a metaphor for her shattered spine. She painted herself weeping, fractured, decapitated and bare, but never passive, always watching. Her pain was not sanitized. She painted the ugliness of trauma with beauty, defiance, and even humor. Each piece was a reclamation of her body, her experience, and her identity as a woman in a world that often tried to define her. But Frida wasn't just telling her story. She was inventing a new kind of visual narrative, one that blended Mexican folk art, surrealism, medical illustration, and profound symbolism. Her paintings became dreamlike autopsies of her soul, framed in color, culture, and myth. By the time she recovered enough to walk again, albeit painfully, Frida was no longer the girl who had wanted to be a doctor. She was an artist, and her art was unlike anything anyone had seen. She had taken the worst thing that had ever happened to her and turned it into a source of creation. Frida Kahlo didn't just paint her pain, she made the world look at it, and in doing so, she turned suffering into a sacred act of self-expression. In 1928, still recovering, still painting, and just 21 years old, Frida Kahlo met the man who would become the most profound and turbulent relationship of her life, Diego Rivera. He was 20 years her senior, already Mexico's most famous painter. Massive in both stature and presence, Rivera was a giant of Mexican muralism, renowned for his sweeping, politically charged frescoes that narrated the story of the Mexican people. Frida had seen his work before. She admired it. But now she sought his opinion on her own creations. She brought her paintings to him at the Ministry of Education, boldly interrupting his scaffolded work to ask bluntly, "Do I have talent?" Diego took one look and replied, "Yes, and not just out of kindness." He recognized in her something rare, an unfiltered voice, raw and unpretentious, brimming with rage, irony, pain, and beauty. They began a relationship that was as consuming as it was creatively fertile. Frida once famously quipped, "I suffered two great accidents in my life. One was the streetcar, the other was Diego." They married in 1929, an unconventional pairing to outsiders. Diego, massive, unfaithful, and politically celebrated. Frida, sharp-tongued, fiercely independent, and already relying on a cane. Her parents famously described it as a marriage between an elephant and a dove. Their bond was passionate but chaotic. Diego supported her art and fostered her growth as a painter. However, he was also relentlessly unfaithful, even with Frida's own sister, Cristina. Frida was devastated, and in turn she took lovers of her own, both men and women, including rumored affairs with Leon Trotsky and painter Georgia Keefe. They divorced in 1939, only to remarry a year later under new terms. This time, Frida would maintain her autonomy, her home, her money, her name. Their second marriage was less about traditional romance and more about a creative partnership and mutual understanding. Despite the betrayals and heartbreak, Diego remained a constant, powerful force in Frida's life. He challenged her, he wounded her, but he also profoundly believed in her as an artist, as a revolutionary, and as a woman who could redefine the very essence of painting. Together, they were not peaceful, but they were undeniably legendary. In the 1930s, Frida Kahlo accompanied Diego Rivera on journeys north to San Francisco, Detroit, and New York as he completed high-profile mural commissions. These years abroad brought her face to face with American industrialism, its burgeoning wealth, and the inherent contradictions of capitalism, leaving her with profound political discomfort. Frida was a proud Mexican nationalist, a committed communist, and a fervent admirer of indigenous traditions. The opulence she witnessed in the United States, especially while the Great Depression ravaged much of the country, only deepened her sense of disillusionment. In letters sent home, she openly mocked the culture's materialism and obsession with superficial appearances. She yearned for the grit, vibrant color, and inherent contradiction of Mexico. While Diego painted enormous murals on factory walls, Frida began to paint smaller, quieter revolutions, deeply personal works on tin and canvas. Her style solidified, becoming sharp, surreal, emotional, and intimately revealing. It was during this period that she produced some of her most iconic self-portraits. Frida didn't simply paint herself out of vanity, she painted herself to survive. Her very identity became her landscape. With her body in constant pain from her accident, multiple surgeries, and a devastating failed pregnancy in Detroit, she turned inward. Her portraits depicted her bleeding, fragmented, exposed, yet her face remained stoic, her gaze unflinching, unapologetic. One of her most powerful works, Henry Ford Hospital, shows her lying on a hospital bed weeping, surrounded by floating symbols of loss, a fetus, a snail, medical equipment, a fractured pelvis. It was raw, graphic, and profoundly emotional, a canvas that bled with truth. Back in Mexico, Frida immersed herself in leftist politics. She and Diego famously welcomed Leon Trotsky into their home while he lived in exile. Frida purposefully wore Tijuana dresses, traditional indigenous garments, not merely as a fashion choice, but as a potent political and cultural statement. Her art was never disconnected from her beliefs. Her identity, her body, and her ideology were intricately intertwined in her work. While Rivera was painting murals celebrating revolution, Frida painted its profound human cost, a body in pieces, a mind aflame, and the self perpetually gazing back. In exile and in illness, she transformed into not just a painter of pain, but a painter of unwavering resistance. When Frida Kahlo returned to Mexico in the late 1930s, she was no longer merely Diego Rivera's wife. She had transformed into something entirely new, a force, an artist whose work radiated with raw honesty, surreal symbolism, and undeniable cultural identity. Back in her beloved homeland, she stepped fully into her own. Her Casa Azul in Coyoacan became a sanctuary of vibrant color and captivating contradiction. Bright cobalt walls, cheerful yellow trim, Aztec statues gracing the garden, monkeys and parrots wandering freely. The house was a living extension of Frida's extraordinary imagination. It was a fusion of tradition and rebellion, elegance and earthy groundedness. Here she surrounded herself with pre-Columbian artifacts, ex-votos, folk art, and revolutionary books. She wore bold Tijuana dresses, wove flowers into her hair, and painted amid the scent of copal incense and the lively sounds of mariachi music drifting in from the street outside. This period marked an explosion of creativity. Her paintings became more intricate, more symbolic, and more overtly political. Works like The Two Fridas eloquently revealed a divided self, one in European dress with a bleeding heart, the other in indigenous clothing, strong and composed. It was Frida's visual autobiography, a portrait of love, loss, and profound heritage. In 1939, she exhibited her work in Paris, where celebrated artists like Picasso, Breton, and Kandinsky praised her fiercely original style. But even among the surrealists, Frida stood apart. When André Breton attempted to label her as one of their own, she pushed back. "They thought I was a surrealist," she famously stated, "but I wasn't. I never painted dreams. I painted my own reality." She painted Mexico, not the romanticized postcard version, but the living, breathing country she adored. Her work pulsed with powerful symbolism: skeletons, hummingbirds, hearts, toms, calm, and blood. She honored the indigenous roots of her homeland, while simultaneously unmasking the violence of its past and present. But even as her artistic voice grew stronger, her health continued its relentless decline. Multiple surgeries, persistent infections, and chronic pain became daily realities. Still, she painted through it all, propped up in bed, her torso bound in corsets, her fingers clenched around the brush. Frida had returned to Mexico not to rest, but to reclaim her power through paint, through politics, and through her fearless embrace of the self. As the 1940s wore on, Frida Kahlo's body continued its relentless betrayal. Her spinal column was deteriorating, and her right leg was constantly infected. She underwent more than 30 surgeries in her lifetime, often in grueling succession. At times, she was bedridden for months, encased in suffocating body casts, or immobilized by traction devices that painfully stretched her bones apart. But still, she painted. Each canvas during these years became both a cathartic release and an unwavering act of resistance. Her works grew darker, more defiant. She painted with a clarity sharpened by pain, refusing to hide behind metaphor. In The Broken Column, she presents herself split down the middle, her body pierced with nails, a cracked launic column replacing her spine. Yet her face remains stoic, her gaze unflinching. Pain for Frida was no longer just a subject, it was her constant companion, her antagonist, her muse. Her political voice also intensified. She formally rejoined the Mexican Communist Party, marched in demonstrations, penned fiery letters, and vociferously condemned imperialism and injustice. When her health no longer permitted her to walk, She appeared at protests in a wheelchair, defiantly holding signs and shouting slogans. In 1953, Frida was finally granted her first solo exhibition in Mexico, a long overdue celebration of her art. However, her health was so fragile that doctors forbade her attendance. So she did what only Frida would do. She arrived by ambulance, carried in on a stretcher, and placed in the center of the gallery on her hospital bed. Dressed in traditional finery, surrounded by her own extraordinary work, she greeted guests with tequila, laughter, and that unyielding fire still burning in her eyes. Her final paintings were both childlike and profoundly harrowing. In Marxism Will Give Health to the Sick, she depicted herself wearing a steel corset, cradled by the hands of Marx, casting away symbols of oppression. Her last known work was a still life of sliced watermelons, one piece bearing the poignant words, "Viva la vida, long live life." Even in the face of imminent death, she remained defiant, joyful, and fiercely political. Frida Kahlo's last portraits weren't just self-portraits. They were acts of revolution, painted in pain, but always signed with life. On July 13, 1954, at the age of 47, Frida Kahlo died in the very place she had been born, the Casa Azul in Coyoacán. The official cause was listed as a pulmonary embolism, but those closest to her whispered of something deeper. She had been ill, yes, but also utterly exhausted by pain, by relentless surgeries, by the long war with her own body. Just days before, she had attended a political protest against the CIA coup in Guatemala. Weak and confined to a wheelchair, she had insisted on going, her clenched fist raised defiantly in the air. Revolution remained her final heartbeat. Her last diary entry was brief but piercing. "I hope the exit is joyful, and I hope never to return." Frida's funeral was held at the Palacio de Bellas Artes, Mexico's most prestigious cultural institution. Her body, draped in the red flag of the Mexican Communist Party, was watched over by friends, family, artists, and revolutionaries. Diego Rivera was inconsolable, calling her the greatest love of his life, even as his betrayals had nearly broken her. But in the years that followed her death, something extraordinary happened. Frida Kahlo refused to disappear. At first, her name was whispered only in art circles. Her works weren't easy to categorize, too political for surrealists, too surreal for traditionalists. But slowly, her image, her story, and her defiance began to resonate. Throughout the 1970s and 1980s, as feminist scholars and activists reclaimed forgotten voices, Frida's became louder. She wasn't just a painter anymore. She was a symbol of pain transformed into beauty, of feminism born through resistance, of Mexican identity celebrated without apology, of queerness, disability, revolution, and profound authenticity. Her face, her signature unibrow, her direct gaze, the flowers in her hair became iconic. Her home became a museum, her diary became a sacred text, and her paintings now hang in the world's greatest museums. Frida Kahlo had lived much of her life in Diego's shadow, but in death she stepped powerfully into her own light. She didn't just leave behind paintings. She left behind a mirror and dared us all to look, not with pity, not with fear, but with fire. Today, Frida Kahlo's face is ubiquitous. Printed on t-shirts, painted on murals, transformed into dolls, memes, posters, and countless icons. Her signature unibrow, her flower-crowned hair, her direct, penetrating gaze, all instantly recognizable. But what truly renders her legacy so potent isn't merely that people know her face. It's that they recognize the profound truth behind it. Frida didn't strive for flawlessness. She didn't fit into neat categories. She wasn't conventional, and she had no desire to be. In a world that often demands perfection, she gifted us realness, raw, messy, vibrant, angry, joyful, contradictory realness. She celebrated what made her unique, her disability, her queerness, her politics, her culture, and she transmuted it into art that transcended borders and decades. She has become more than an artist. She is a global symbol of defiance, feminism, cultural pride, and creative resistance. For queer communities, she stands as a fearless bisexual icon who lived openly and unapologetically in a time that demanded silence. For women, she is a powerful reminder that power doesn't require permission. For disabled artists, she is living proof that pain can fuel the brush, not stifle it. And for Mexico, she is a cherished daughter, reclaimed, fierce, folkloric, and eternally woven into the national soul. Her paintings, once dismissed as too strange or too personal, are now among the most revered in the world. Works like the two Fridas, Self-Portrait with Thorn Necklace and Hummingbird, and The Broken Column aren't just viewed. They are deeply felt by anyone who has ever suffered and felt the need to transmute that suffering into something sacred. She lived in the margins and transformed them into center stage. She embraced contradiction. A communist who wore gold, a woman betrayed who found love again, a body in pieces with a soul unbreakable. And through it all, she painted not just with color, but with unwavering conviction. Frida Kahlo never sought to be a symbol. She simply told the truth about herself. And in doing so, she illuminated a profound truth for millions of others who had never before seen themselves reflected in art. Now, when we see her face, we see courage. We see color, we see resistance, we see Frida, not gone, but immortal,